Okay, so yeah, I'm just that now. Hello everyone, welcome to 52 Plus Shade of Gothic conference series organised by PopMech Association and to our thematic session, the Eco Gothic. I'm really excited to have Dr. Elizabeth Parker and Dr. Michelle Poland with us today and about all of the amazing conversations that we are going to have. So thank you very much for joining us. Now just letting me introduce you to our audience. So Elizabeth is the author of the monograph, The Forest and the Eco-Gothic, The Deep Dark Woods in the Popular Imagination, published by Palgrave Gothic in March 2020. She's the founding editor of the open access journal Gothic Nature, New Directions in Eco-Horror and the Eco-Gothic, and television editor for the Irish Journal of Gothic and Horror Studies. She has co-organised several conferences on space, place, and the relationship between the Gothic and the non-human. Has published her work in various titles such as Plant Horror, Approaches to the Monstrous Vegetal in Fiction and Film, and Trans Ecology, Transgender Perspectives on the Environment, and is co-editor of Landscapes of Liminality Between Space and Place. She has taught English literature and courses on popular culture and a number of universities across the UK and Ireland, and currently works at St Mary's University, Twickenham. Michelle is co-editor of Gothic Nature, New Directions in Eco-Horror and the Eco-Gothic. Her primary research interests are in Gothic, eco-criticism and environmental history, as well as popular scientific and cultural discourses about the Anthropocene. She was awarded her doctoral thesis titled Gothic Forest in the Anthropocene in 2019 and is currently working on a book proposal on this topic. She has published articles on various aspects of Gothic nature in journals such as Green Letters and Critical Survey, and has organised related conferences and public engagement events. She taught English literature at the University of Lincoln and was an archival assistant at the Tennyson Research Centre for several years, and now works as a research impact manager at Nottingham Trent University. So let's welcome Elizabeth and Michelle. It's so good to have you here today, and thanks once again for joining. We're really grateful that you're here today with us to share your knowledge and ideas. And not to keep you waiting any longer, I'll dive straight into the questions. So you mentioned in the introduction to the Gothic Nature Journal website that you bonded over your fascination with the realities and representations of the darker side of nature, and particularly love of the deep dark woods. Can you tell us a bit more about this inspiration that drew you to establishing the journal, and what did you mean by the darker side of nature and the deep dark woods?
Definitely. So I just wanted to start off really quickly by saying a big thank you for having us both here today. I know we're both really excited to be here, and we think what you're doing is amazing and the whole conference looks great. So yeah, a massive thank you from both of us just as a starting point.
Seconded as well.
So I was going to start off by talking about establishing the journal, as you said. So yeah, the kind of background for how that came about is that I was involved in co-organising a conference in 2014 called Landscapes of Liminality. And I brought into kind of the panel that I was on some of the kind of gothic-y, naturey things, and I loved that. And I just got excited and I thought, oh my goodness, it'd be amazing to have an entire conference on this. And then I thought, is that too niche? Will other people be interested? I don't know. But I set it up with the support of my amazing supervisor, Bernice Murphy, and a couple of other PhD students. And we were delighted to see that lots of people were interested. And it was from those kind of 2 days of having those conversations, seeing these different panels, seeing that there's such an amazing community of people interested in these subjects, that I then got overexcited again and thought, could we have a whole journal? And started sort of enthusiastically saying this. And I think a lot of people thought I was mad and was like, it's more work than you realize, which was absolutely true, by the way. But nonetheless, I pushed forward, and something very, very lovely that came from that first conference is that I was introduced to Michelle. And as I was moving to the editing stages of issue 1 and realizing, oh my God, this is enormous, I thought I'll drop an email to that random lovely woman I met. And thankfully, that random lovely woman is now one of my close friends, and the rest is history. So we've moved forward from there. So yeah, I think that's the kind of origin of the journal, just kind of overexcitement, really.
I'm very glad that you did invite me, so thank you again for that. So just to kind of address the part of your question about what do we mean when we're talking about the darker side of nature, which is obviously what the Gothic Nature Journal centres on. when we're talking about that phrase, we're referring to that kind of often under or unacknowledged side of our relationship with the non-human world, and that is to say, of course, fear. So this fear of nature, or kind of like the apathy towards nature. Simon Eastock refers to this kind of phenomenon as ecophobia, of course. You could say that this is arguably the defining characteristic of Western humanity's interactions with the modern human world. Or at least, I think it's probably more fair to say that ecophobia defines industrial capitalist society's relationships with nature. Of course, ecophobia, this apathy or fear of nature, underpins our kind of attempts to control, destroy, or even silence the non-human world. And it's certainly a key driver of the Anthropocene, which, if nobody is familiar with that term, Anthropocene is a new geological epoch caused by human activity and impacts on the Earth. So yeah, we're really interested in this idea of the fear of nature because it not only shapes our experiences and interactions with the environment, but it also importantly informs our perceptions of nature. There's a really rich history in the Western cultural imagination where nature has kind of been variously constructed as kind of monstrous or spectral or sublime and uncanny. They're often very much spaces to be feared. And of course, the way that we imagine nature, the stories that we tell about it, the way that we perceive it and the way that we understand it has such an impact. It has had a detrimental effect on the way we've treated it as well. So just in a nutshell, it's this relationship between our fears of nature and our actions upon it that interests Elizabeth and I. And the Gothic, which is of course a mode that deals in fear, it provides the critical tools to engage productively with the subject.
That's really interesting answer, and I think I'm really glad you mentioned kind of the idea of stories, talking about this fear of nature and also our relationship with nature as well. And I think that's leads nicely to the second question. And I'm curious about basically how do you define the Eco-Gothic and kind of this kind of particular trope, and I'm also particularly interested in whether your experience of running the Eco-Gothic Journal kind of participate or kind of contribute all to your knowledge of the Eco-Gothic, or any other aspects that might have shaped your knowledge of the Eco-Gothic.
Yeah, so unsurprisingly, we have quite a lot to say about this, but we'll try and edit ourselves down. But yeah, so to start with the kind of term Eco-Gothic, and I think that there's a lot of discussion about what that word actually even means, because it is, generally speaking, it really is quite new. So I think that's something we want to flag, is that the term is evolving, understandings of it are evolving. So while we have our kind of opinions about what it is and is not, we're aware of wider dialogues, and that, we can get into that, into the questions, maybe see what other people think. Another thing to say from the outset is that the idea that Eco-Gothic kind of deals with isn't new. I mean, if you kind of boil it down to the very kind of essence of, fear of nature and fear and nature, that's obviously as old as humankind, right? It's the language that is the element that is new. I was going to say a shameless shout out was to my book. Chapter 2 has a full history of the Eco-Gothic and the term, which is going to be much more articulate than me live. But yes, so Eco-Gothic, obviously you've got eco and Gothic. So the kind of essence there is bringing together the words ecology and Gothic and seeing what happens when we do those things. So looking at that juxtaposition, how does that make us feel? How does that make us think? What does it mean? Is it ecology, nature itself is Gothic? Is there Gothic in nature? And kind of unpacking all of that. So in terms of the history of the term in theory, it's often cited that it began with two essays, one by Simon C. Estock and one by Tom J. Hillard. And I think Michelle already mentioned the term ecophobia, which was from Estock's essay in, I think it was 2009, which is essentially the fear of nature. And he says in that essay that we don't talk enough about our fear of nature. We talk too much about our kind of love of nature and the bucolic, idyllic side of it, and that it desperately needs theorizing. So for me, anyway, that was kind of a call to arms. I was like, yes, it does desperately need theorizing. How exciting. And I think a lot has come from there. Similarly, Hillard talks about eco-criticism and how that's kind of born from nature loving, and how it is, quote, astonishing that we haven't looked at that kind of darker side, that darker underbelly of nature. And another thing that we should say is that he was the first person, to my knowledge anyway, to use this term Gothic nature. So while we have that branded all over our journal, it has come from him and that original essay. Smith and Hughes obviously did the big famous book on Eco-Gothic in 2013, which I think most people are familiar with. And they started off in their introduction, I think they were the first to kind of come in and say Eco-Gothic is not a genre, Eco-Gothic is a lens. It's a way of looking things, it's a way of deconstructing. It's about positioning the ecological beyond the words worthian. There have then been special issues of journals, there have been other books. Something that's got a lot of attention is 19th century in the Eco-Gothic, and you can see that in Del Principe's work, and also the book by Dawn Keatley and Matthew Wynne Seville. And one final thing I want to say in terms of existing criticism is that there's a woman called Suzanne Roberts who hasn't kind of officially published, but I came across her PhD online and it's readily available, and it was absolutely brilliant and it really informed my work. So I just wanted to give a shout out to her. In terms of defining the term Eco-Gothic, something that I found useful is to think of the word eco-horror and then to think of the word Eco-Gothic. And are they similar? Are they different? If so, how? And something that you'll often see is that Eco-Gothic and eco-horror are used interchangeably. And as a PhD student, I definitely found that really confusing as I was going along, and I was like, oh wait, what does it mean? Is it a genre? Is it? And I got a bit lost. So this was something I spent a lot of time kind of thinking about and trying to unpack. And where I came to it with was thinking about the words on their own, horror and the Gothic. And I think of horror as something that's quite sort of immediate. It's tied to events, it's tied to kind of storyline and that kind of thing. Whereas the word Gothic makes me immediately think of setting, of ambience, of atmosphere. I think castle, convents, big forests, mountains, the sublime, all of that. So I think that's a kind of really key part of the Eco-Gothic for me, is that kind of environmental element. Also the fact that I think Gothic encapsulates fear and desire in a way that is perhaps not so obvious in horror. And I think you get that kind of interplay in Eco-Gothic a lot, where that's that kind of binary of something that's alluring, that's inviting you in, but is also very, very terrifying at the same time. Eco-horror, I think, is a little bit clearer in the sense that you've got, in theory, you've got this, and I'm sure some people will disagree with me here, but in theory, you've got those ingredients of like, it's going to be nature's revenge. It's going to be about raising environmental awareness. And you're going to have humans at the center, or that's quite likely. You're going to have humans being attacked, having consequences of bad things. And I don't think that's necessarily the case in the Eco-Gothic. I think it is sometimes, but I think you get films and texts where humans are much more kind of standing back. I'm thinking of examples like Picnic at Hanging Rock, for example, where you can have long, lingering kind of images of scenery and kind of creepiness generally, or the Austrian film Hotel, which is brilliant, where humans kind of don't necessarily have to be at the center there. So, sorry, I've talked for ages on this, but I think in a nutshell, I think of the Eco-Gothic as something, I call it in my book a flavored mode. So I think it is this lens, it is this way of looking at things. But at the same time, I think it's got trappings of genre in the sense that when you look at what the Eco-Gothic is looking at, there is this kind of commonality of theme between things. But yes, anyway, I'll stop talking, go.
Throw in my 2 cents. Yeah, I think the most strong. I also struggled throughout my PhD, kind of differentiating between those two terms. The most straight, I completely support what Elizabeth just said as well. I think if you're coming, especially if you're a student, you're coming to this for the first time, the most straightforward way I have found of thinking about these terms is that eco-horror as a term came about because of the crop of horror films about the nature's vengeance on humanity in the past 50 years. So in some ways, eco-horror is a lot more generic. It is seen as a genre. Eco-Gothic, of course, only came about in the past 10 years. And I think in terms of definitions, it is most productive. The Eco-Gothic is most productive when you understand it as a critical lens through which we can examine our kind of troubling relationship with nature. I think that's why it's gained such rapid popularity over the past 10 years as well. Like, it is a niche area, but the amount of people and the amount of interest that we're getting, even with the journal, it's just grown hugely. And I think it's because it allows us to explore the significance of the kind of monstrous and sublime and spectral and uncanny constructions of nature and the cultural imagination. And then obviously, importantly, it allows us to explore what that might mean about our often kind of dysfunctional relationship with the environment in reality. I'm just kind of picking up on that. I think this kind of criticism is crucial in the present ecological crisis, because many of our imaginings of Gothic nature are becoming unnervingly an actuality. And you find that science and media often adopt the Gothic mode to kind of express ecosocial crisis as well. So it's a really important tool to kind of get stuck in and interrogate those things. So kind of in a nutshell, I think Eco-Gothic can kind of best understood as an interrogation of the ecology in Gothic, but also the ecology as Gothic. And the wonderful thing about seeing it like that is that it opens up so much potential for new, innovative, kind of interdisciplinary collaboration as well. And to kind of address and you asked the question about does the journal help us kind of better understand Eco-Gothic? And for sure, yes, it does. I think one of the things that's kind of helped me working on the journal is that you can see like kind of 4 definite sort of sub-themes or spaces that are coming about that are all really exciting. So kind of I say like the 4 kind of key spaces for Eco-Gothic are the dark forest. So this includes all dark green manner of things, so plants, trees, woods, wilderness. The second key space is the dark ocean and all other watery forms. The third is the kind of monstrous body, in particular, unsurprisingly, the non-human animal. And then there's less of a space, but I was trying to shoehorn it in a little bit. The fourth one is the uncanny future. So there's loads of scholarship at the minute on kind of apocalypse or dystopia or post-apocalypse as well that deals with climate crisis. And the discussions that sit under the umbrella of Eco-Gothic and under those 4 spaces are all really varied. Anything from literature, philosophy, ecology, geology, history, politics, cultural discussions, but they're all united in this kind of ability to productively engage with the anxieties that arise from our kind of realization that we coexist with the more than human world. Yeah.
I just wanted to add really quickly to that about what we've learned kind of with doing the journal is I know something that I found one of the most exciting things to do as an editor is to see essays come in on things that I never in a million years would have thought of as being Eco-Gothic, and then going, oh my goodness, and then of course when it's a brilliant essay going, yes, it absolutely is. And for example, in the latest edition we had an amazing standout essay from Katarina Barnes, and it was on Inuit death metal throat singing, which I was like, how as I was beginning to read the abstract, I was like, oh, go on, let's see. And then I was like, absolutely, it was just fascinating about kind of Inuit constructions of Mother Nature and how that rage comes through in music. And yeah, so that's been a really exciting part of the journal, I think, just broadening the discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much for the answers. I think you give us a lot of very rich answers and lots of ideas to think with, and it's definitely better my understanding of Eco-Gothic because I'm slightly confused about what it really means. So yeah, thank you very much. So let's kind of dig a little bit deeper into this particular mode of investigating the relationship between humans and non-humans, and particularly in the context of American literature. So could you comment a bit on the origin of the Eco-Gothic in America, and perhaps on some of the aspects of American culture and politics that perhaps brought about its emergence?
Of course, I'll take this one, as I did a chapter on kind of early American Gothic, so I'm feeling a bit more confident than the later stuff. I mean, this has kind of come out in what we've just spoken about, but just to caveat that, I think it's important that the way we're approaching the Eco-Gothic is as a critical tool. So it is difficult, and we can't strictly talk about the origins of Eco-Gothic in America kind of back then because it is so new. But that said, there is, of course, this really rich history of wilderness and American Gothic that's shaped American identity and it's central to much of the Eco-Gothic scholarship that's going on now. So I won't do a whole history of wilderness and American imagination, you'll be thankful to know, but just as a kind of brief overview to kind of as a taster that we might want to pick up on in the Q&A. Many have kind of argued that early North American Gothic, and just by American Gothic, I'm referring to white settler colonial Gothic in North America, just to be clear. It's deeply entrenched and informed by early settler experiences with the New World. So anything from kind of like green colonialism to Puritan perceptions of the dark and howling wilderness. And just to kind of broadly encapsulate this, I think for early settlers, there are kind of 2 key reasons why the wilderness was feared. So the firstly is that wilderness obviously posed a physical threat to their survival. So anything, again, fears of attack from wild animals, from indigenous peoples, to the possibility that they might lose their sanity in an environment that's just completely unrestrained by civilization. And the second kind of key reasons is that for many Christians, the wilderness had these kind of connections to moral vacancy. So it harbored all sorts of heathens and witches and all sorts of disciples of the devil. So conquering wilderness was really important because it wasn't just a matter of profit or obtaining security, but it was about this kind of civilizing light of Christianity overcoming the ungodly darkness of the woods. And a lot of early American Gothic often invokes this kind of ecophobic legacy. So you see it obviously most famously in Charles Brockden Brown's Edgar Huntley, or Washington Irving's Legend of Sleepy Hollow. And you also see it in Nathaniel Hawthorne, but I find that his work's particularly interesting because, yes, it does build on this legacy of ecophobia, but it also challenges it. And that's because Hawthorne was interested in kind of romantic transcendentalist philosophy. He was acutely aware of the heavy deforestation that was taking place in New England at this time during the 19th century. So he was exposed to thinking that was actually quite alarmed by the dominant hatred of the wilderness and the subsequent treatment of it. So if you look at texts like Young Goodman Brown or The Maypole of Merrymount or The Scarlet Letter, his work often reveals this kind of strange tension that I think still exists today about ingrained ecophobia, but also this like emerging sense of unease about the costs and consequences of environmental destruction. So yeah, that's just a little flavour of, I think, actually some of the kind of interesting points that you might want to look into with early American Gothic.
I think building what you're saying there, Michelle, like I always think if you want a kind of 2-hour quick introduction to the awfulness and fascinating nature of kind of the wilderness and that early settlement period, I think immediately of the film The Witch from 2015, which is just kind of a crash course in all of those fears from that time, I think.
Thank you. Yeah, I think you give a really condensed overview of kind of the American eco-Gothic literature, and so that kind of leads me to, so if that is kind of the literature and the mood and popularity of American eco-Gothic literature in the past, do you think that kind of talk about, you know, deforestation and, you know, ecophobia, has that legacy been you know, ongoing in the present day? Is it still now with us today in American eco-Gothic literature at the moment?
I think very much so, yes. And I think actually the popularity is growing, and I don't think that's just my kind of own interest coming into it, but I can see in kind of different conversations and different, you know, avenues of popular culture and things, that these ideas and these themes are becoming increasingly mainstream, and there's almost a sense of kind of zeitgeistiness about it. And I think one of my favorite things about the Eco-Gothic is that once you start talking about what it is, everyone has something to say. Like, it's not a kind of niche area, I don't think. When you start talking about, you know, where it's come from, unpacking these ideas, it kind of doesn't matter what people's backgrounds are or interests are. Like, I found at dinner parties the most unlikely people have been like, oh my goodness, and they get so animated and they tell me things I've not thought of. And I think part of that on the more kind of depressing side is, I think it's growing in popularity in part because our kind of mass sense of collective guilt with how we're treating the environment is growing and becoming more kind of mainstream and palpable. So I think, I don't know, when you're talking about the kind of the mood of Eco-Gothic now, I think it's grim in some ways, but I also think it's absolutely captivating as well.
Do you have anything to add, Michelle?
Yeah, so I think kind of just to build on that, I think the thing I've noticed with contemporary North American Gothic is that it seems to have taken a step out of the deep, dark woods and into the kind of very deep, dark future. There's a definite contrast between early American Gothic, which obviously, as we just discussed, was kind of preoccupied and kind of haunted by its ecophobic legacy on the one hand, and then you've got contemporary American Gothic on the other, which seems to play out our very real kind of eco-anxieties about living in this kind of unknown, human-caused but not human-controlled geological epoch. So the kind of most prominent examples of this would be Jeff Vandermeer's Southern Reach trilogy. You've got Margaret Atwood's Mad Adam trilogy. There's also a novel that has just come to the post today for me, The Cabin at the End of the World by Tremblay, which I'm really excited to read as well. So that kind of plays on the cabin in the woods, but also post-war apocalyptic kind of feels. It merges the two. So yeah, the scene, especially like in Atwood's trilogy, for instance, like it's all kind of weird and gothic and eerie and nerving because the events that take place are based on kind of what if scenarios. So, you know, what if we were to continue on this destructive path we're on now? And all of the things that take place in the book, even though it might seem like a kind of paranoid fantasy of scientists, it's not. You know, these books have basis in reality, and I think that's why it's so unnerving. And of course, as well, Margaret Atwood builds on Shelley's Frankenstein legacy of fusing science fiction with Gothic conventions, but this time into an eye with a kind of world ravaged by climate change. And just kind of, sorry, I'm kind of thinking out loud here, but just to add to that, I think it's really important that just to stress again that we've been speaking solely about white settler American Gothic here, and we're both very acutely aware that the Eco-Gothic needs decolonising. So just to kind of counteract my plug of Margaret Atwood, I'd like to point you to Katerina Barnes' essay, which is in issue 2 of Gothic Nature, called Soundtrack to Settler Colonialism, which Elizabeth mentioned before. So she explores the music of this contemporary Inuit artist and throat singer, and she kind of explores the way it challenges the dominant settler colonial narrative about, you know, survival against the hostilities of nature being this really like the key to the Canadian experience, which obviously Margaret Atwood explores in her survival book. And Barnes kind of instead demonstrates how the true horror lies in the monstrous treatment of Indigenous peoples in the natural world, not in nature itself. So again, I think it's just really important to sort of say we're not the gatekeepers here to what's really key in contemporary Eco-Gothic now, and actually, you know, we really encourage people to explore all these different other texts and forms as well.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. Yeah, with the idea of how we need to like pay more attention to kind of different narratives and forms of narrative of, you know, like Indigenous people or Black people, and kind of just shift attention away from, you know, the majority sort of narrative voice. And yeah, and that kind of did me to the question about films as well. So did you think, sorry about this, do you think that kind of the eco-Gothic modes and the ways in which, as you mentioned, like, you know, ecophobia and modes like that, do you think that they also manifested in American films as well? And I'm thinking of like the similarities and differences between American eco-Gothic literature and films. If you could comment on that, that'd be great.
Yeah, definitely. So I think the very short answer is yes, definitely. And to kind of touch on that, well, before I go into the film part, but to touch on that difference between film and literature, I don't know if Michelle will want to add anything to this, but we were sitting down and thinking about it, and it was actually quite a hard question. I think this was, out of all of your questions, this was the one that kind of stumped us the most. We were like, hang on, is it different? How is it different? And I think the kind of conclusion that I came to anyway was that for the most part, it's really quite similar in terms of like how fear functions, how it plays out, how it's structured. I think that's really quite similar between text and film or TV. But I think the only kind of differences that I would note come down to the experience of what it's like as a reader, thinking about the choices made by the author, and obviously having your own imagination building from what you see on the page versus the experience of a viewer, and those kind of choices from the creators of the film or the TV show or whatever it is, with the kind of camera angles and things like that. And I know there's been quite a lot written about anthropocentrism and film, in terms of, especially when you film nature, you film it as kind of landscape from an overview shot. Like we see that again and again in horror, and like partly that's kind of, you know, it's creepy, it's vast, but it also puts us in the position of that kind of godly figure looking down, able to kind of own and see it all. So I think there's something interesting going on there. But I don't know, Michelle, if you wanted to come in there or
no, you can carry on.
No, sorry. But otherwise, in terms of film, yes, so that's what I work with for the most part, is film rather than literature. And what I did in my work is I took the landscape of the forest as a kind of eco-Gothic case study. So it was my way into kind of talking about the eco-Gothic more broadly. And when I think about kind of film and the forest, it's basically just such a cliche. That idea of being in the forest and scared in a film is something we've seen in more films than I could ever lay my hands on. And a lot of people are kind of talking about that kind of, active cliche element there. Something that I found interesting, thinking about the kind of development of film and these themes, was that when I was working on my PhD, I kind of started with what I think of as the forest giant. So I'm talking about the Blair Witch Project, Evil Dead, Twin Peaks, these kind of key massive texts that have really taken us into the kind of eco-Gothic wilderness in America. And something that was really interesting to see while I was working is that every single one of those forest giants got remade. So I think there's something in the kind of culture and environment where people are wanting to go back to these texts and revisit them. And I won't go into it now, but I think there's lots of interesting stuff to unpack when you compare kind of how do we tell that story now compared to how do we tell that story then. And maybe even especially with Twin Peaks, because it sort of denies going back to the woods in some ways. But anyway, that's something we can talk about in questions if people are interested. In terms of how the Eco-Gothic manifests in film, that's something that I can come back to a little bit more in question 6, I think. But I think for the most part, in a nutshell, it's about kind of bringing us back to that sense of bewilderment and thinking about the etymology of the word bewildered, which is really about being in the wilderness, being lost, being confused. And I think that's what these texts do. And I think film is really powerful in taking us very quickly into that. And I'm just a big fan, so I go on about it. But something like the Blair Witch Project, very, very little happens. It's a lot of shots of trees and panicked torchlights, but it's very, very evocative. It's very bewildering, and I think it captures that kind of sense of viewing nature as a maze, as something to be lost in, rather than nature as something that we own and can control. And I think film is very powerful there.
Just to briefly add as well, because film is I love watching films, but in terms of criticism, it's not my thing. But just to add that, actually, in addition to the kind of crop of eco horror films that have come about, like we mentioned before, in the past 50 years, what's really interesting at the minute, in the past, I would say, decade, maybe even 5 years, there seems to be this crop of folk horror films that are coming out, and as a result, a lot of folk horror scholarship as well. It's really new, excited, uncharted kind of territory. There's a couple of essays in issue 2 by Dawn Keatley and Alexandra Hawke that would be worth a look at if that's piquing your interest. But kind of notable films would be kind of Robert Eggers' The Witch, David Bruckner's The Ritual, and is it Ari? I think it's Ari Aster's Midsummer as well. So that's just something to keep an eye out for.
Yeah, thank you. So now I have a special question for each of you, and I'm going to start with Elizabeth. So in your most recent book, The Forest and the Eco-Gothic, you mentioned that because today the majority of humans in the Western world live in towns and cities, and predators that were once threatening to us are facing extinction, quote, there is little practical reason to be afraid of the wood, unquote. Then you go on to say that, yeah, there is much evidence to suggest that we continue indeed to be terrified of the wide wood, unquote. And this led you to pursue the questions of why we evidently still fear the forest and what exactly it is that we fear when we fear this environment. So what answer have you found in asking these pertinent questions, and how does that feel about the relationship between humans and non-humans?
Thank you, that's a really lovely question. So yeah, this was kind of my starting point, and what is kind of the crux of my book really is, when I was looking into kind of fear of the woods and everything, I started to look into kind of, literal reasons why we should be scared of the forest. Do many people die in the woods nowadays? And the answer is no. When you start sort of looking at statistics, you're much, much, much more in danger in a city than you are going for a walk in the woods. And yet there is that kind of primal fear that still takes you over, even though we know that most of the kind of predators, they're extinct because of us or in danger of extinction. So yes, that was something I really sat down with, and I was like, okay, I want to really think about why and unpack this. And I have to say that during these years when I was looking at this, my whole apartment looked like a serial killer's apartment, because I was just scribbling everything, sticking it on the walls, tying it together with thread. I did not look particularly sane, but nonetheless, what I basically came up with was the governing structure for my book, which was where I looked at what I found to be the 7 reasons why we fear the forest, and the 3 ways that these fears manifest. And I'll just very quickly run through those. But yeah, I termed them my 7 theses, which is kind of in homage to Jeffrey Jerome Cohen, who wrote I think it's Monster Theory, and he had 7 theses as well. But Yeah, so the first one is the forest is against civilization. So we fear it because we define civilization in contrast to the forest. Civilization is being built out of the forest. We destroy the forest to kind of make that space urban or settled or whatever. And you've got that sense of kind of boundaries that are always being threatened, which is very much at the heart of the Gothic, right? That kind of porous boundary. And I think with forest, with foliage, you've got that sense as well of something like those boundaries creeping and growing and encroaching inwards. Number two, the forest is tied to the past. So I think something quite important about the forest environment is that when you're in it, unless you're a dendrochronologist or an amazing biologist, it's very, very difficult to tell what kind of era you're in. Like there's no reason why it would look particularly different now being dropped in the woods than particularly different 500 years ago. And so I think that sense of timelessness is quite potentially eerie, and it takes us back to a time where we kind of worry that we're going to regress in some way as well. The third reason is the forest is a space of trial. And this is something that I think you see in fairy tales. And fairy tales are very much tied to woods and our fears of our woods. And an awful lot of particularly Western fairy tales are, of course, set in forests. And often the trial, and this is in horror movies as well, the task at hand is to survive, whether that's kind of physically because you need to eat and stay alive, or whether that's mentally as well, and kind of thinking about that breakdown. And if anyone's kind of interested in those themes, I'd recommend a film called Yellow Brick Road, where they take experts into the forest and they take like a psychologist in, they take all different experts of the like pinnacles of society, and spoiler alert, it still breaks down. It's awful. Fourth reason is it's a space in which we are lost. And I think that's a big one. I think that's something that comes to mind straight away as you think of the woods and you think Hansel and Gretel, you think little brother and little sister, you think that fear of being away from family, from settlement, from things that you recognize as being lost. Fifth reason, the forest is a consuming space. So I think that's tied to the idea of being lost, this kind of threat that the forest is going to somehow consume you, that maybe if you die in the woods or you get taken in, you're going to be imbibed into the very environment. There's an awful lot you'll see in literature and film about kind of imagery of mouths of forests and mouths in forests coming to get us. Also, that's massive with monsters. One of our biggest fears is being eaten in the woods. Sixth point is the forest is tied to the unconscious. And this is something you see when you start looking at kind of psychological works, and the imagery of like the tree is kind of above the ground, the roots below the ground, all that kind of id-ego tension. You've also got a section in Freud's essay on the uncanny where he gives a kind of definition of the uncanny at one point as returning to the same point in the woods again and again. And you think you're walking in a straight line, but you keep coming back and you're walking in circles in the woods. Exactly like what happens in the Blair Witch Project and a lot of other texts similarly. Finally, the forest is an anti-Christian space. So there's the sense or the fear that the forest is a space where there's either no God or the wrong God or gods. There's also a big tie between the forest and paganism, and kind of that idea, that sort of Christian fear of, oh God, pagans are, sacrificing humans and there's blood-drenched groves and it's all terrible and awful. But something I should say for all of those 7 reasons is the forest is a binary space and it's thought of in extremes. So every time you've got an example of it being gothic and dark and frightening, you've also got an example of it being enchanted and beautiful and magical. So for each of those 7 pieces, you'll also have kind of counter examples where you'll have an unbelievably Christian forest or an unbelievably opposite forest, in the sense that maybe it's a space where you find yourself in nature as well. And I think that's something that always haunts that environment, and sometimes other Gothic environments as well. In terms of the 3 ways that this manifests, so I divided this into number 1, the forest itself. So there's a line in Evil Dead where after that famous tree molestation scene, she runs in and she says, oh my God, the woods, and someone says to her, what's in the woods? And she says, no, there's nothing in the woods, it's the woods themselves. So I think that's quite interesting to look at the woods themselves. When is it animate? When is it the actual branches, the actual soil, the actual environment? And is that even possible? The second way is monsters in the forest. It manifests through creatures and deep, creepy things coming and getting us, chasing us, wanting to eat us, all that kind of thing again. And then the third way is the kind of idea that it's actually humans in the forest that make it dark, that make it Gothic. Like it's never Gothic before we bring that Gothicity, I think I just made up a word, bring that Gothic element into it ourselves. So in terms of the kind of answers that I found about human, non-human relationships, something that I found myself coming back to a lot was a word that Smith and Hughes used in their introduction to Eco-Gothic, which was about fragmentation and our kind of quite emotional feelings, I think, about being fragmented from nature now. You know, we've gone from being forest dwellers to being apartment house dwellers, as Jay Appleton says. And I think, you know, that's not everyone's experience, but it's a lot of people's experience. And I think there is that kind of sense of loss, of homesickness there, of being fragmented, of being separate to something that maybe we shouldn't be so separate from. And I was actually telling Michelle recently that I watched a documentary that some people might have heard of called My Octopus Teacher recently. And it follows the story of a man who is suffering from depression, and he goes into the sea every single day and he builds this relationship with this animal that we traditionally see as a monster, that we traditionally see as massively, massively other. And I found myself getting really emotional watching it. And then when I read reviews, lots of other people had felt the same and said, like, I think one reviewer said, this is the love story that we need right now. And I really, really feel that. So I think the last thing I wanted to say there is that I think there is a kind of hope in the Eco-Gothic and exploring these feelings of fragmentation. And I think especially when we think about the fear that I think is so inherent to the Eco-Gothic, because I think fear is really important because it has the power to displace cynicism. So when you're frightened, you know, if you're safe and at home and you're going la 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 la, you know, a forest isn't particularly frightening. You're like, oh, statistically, it's not dangerous. It's, you know, it's fine. Watch the Blair Witch Project and walk into the woods, and I dare you not to feel frightened. You know, fear does kind of make us think differently about these spaces, and I think it makes us think differently about nature. So my most kind of biggest interest, I think, in the Eco-Gothic is the idea that maybe this is a way to re-enchant nature and reconnect ourselves to nature.
That's brilliant. And I think a lot of what you said I can relate to as well. You know, the idea of like being lost in the wood and just sense of uncanny. You know, like when you feel like you walk into, you know, a forest and you might feel like someone might be there or something might be there, and you just kind of feel very overwhelmed. And I think when I have that experience or kind of imagine the experience, really, I can feel some connection, or, you know, definitely like connection with nature. I just feel like there's something there and I can feel it in my bones, and that's just, you know, something really interesting. And the idea of fear as well, you know, like being, you're not the center of this world, you know, you are surrounded by so many creatures and trees and everything's around. So yes, it's really interesting, and I think you book the read as well. It's really sounding interesting. So the next question is from Michelle. So I'm interested in the intersection of the cultural debates on the Anthropocene with the Eco-Gothic. So it seems that the language that some contemporary scholars use to expound this concept of the Anthropocene invites a strong sense of horror, dread and trauma. So Timothy Clark, for example, considers the Anthropocene bewildering and destructive and calls it a crisis of skill and agency and disorder and helplessness. As a result, there's understandably a concern that this sense of overwhelmingness and despondency might cause either, you know, climate change denial or climate change paralysis, where you just don't know what to do about the ecological crisis anymore. So considering that the Eco-Gothic explores, you know, like human fear and horror when encountering a kind of a dark and monstrous nature, do you think that the Eco-Gothic in the context of the Anthropocene might risk preventing us, you know, in some way tackling climate change effectively?
Thank you. I think that was a really interesting question, and kind of touches upon a lot of my interests. In a nutshell, no, and here's why. We've kind of touched briefly on this kind of throughout the interview, but of course, like my understanding of the Eco-Gothic is that it's a mode that helps us to critically and productively engage with these completely legitimate fears. So in kind of scientific and cultural media narratives of climate crisis, and obviously narratives of the Anthropocene as well, you'll see that it's kind of variously framed between and in terms of short-term apocalypse and kind of long-term hope. But no matter how the climate crisis or Anthropocene is framed, the public reactions is a little bit anecdotal, but public reaction tends to be the same. So it's usually defined, public reaction can be defined by inertia, inaction, everyday denialism, and indeed paralysis, which is what you and Timothy Clark touch on. But at the heart of that, at the heart of inertia and inaction and paralysis, is fear. So kind of just to briefly touch on Timothy Clark's book, which I assume that's what you were citing from, the Eco-Criticism on the Edge, which was published in 2015, I think. This book is absolutely fantastic. I think it's a really key book for eco-criticism and obviously for eco-gothicists as well. And the reason it's really stayed with me because it completely changed the way I think, and it pushes the boundaries of criticism in important ways. So for those who haven't read this text, just in a nutshell, Clark says that it's no longer good enough basically for eco-critics to simply examine ecological tropes in literature or state that a text expresses some kind of environmentalist ideologies. And he considers some of the problems that the Anthropocene kind of poses philosophically. So for example, the Anthropocene kind of confounds our human sense of time and space. Thinking about it also involves a kind of loss of our sense of proportion and reality. The idea that if I turn my car engine on, that is going to lead to complete geological shift. It just seems ridiculous, but it is true when you think about that action happening en masse for the past 100 years or so. He also talks about unacknowledged denialism, and ultimately this kind of all amalgamates to the Anthropocene's sort of sheer unreadability and unthinkability. And Clark kind of challenges eco-critics to begin the nearly impossible but completely necessary task of dissecting and engaging with these kind of enormous issues, and forcing us to kind of think beyond our anthropocentric way of thinking. And obviously, even just saying those phenomena out loud, it does feel overwhelming. But at the heart of that kind of feeling of overwhelming is anxiety and fear. But this is exactly why I think Eco-Gothic, which obviously deals with fear of the environment, I think it's really well suited to the task that Clark asks us to take up. And I don't want to overemphasize the role that Eco-Gothic has to play in tackling climate crisis, because obviously that's too big a task, and that would be a ridiculous thing to say. But I do think Eco-Gothic has a role to play in making that dread and that horror and that bewilderment that you were talking about when we think about the Anthropocene. It just makes it a little bit more digestible, because it provides the kind of critical tools to help us kind of read a world that's transitioning into the unknown, and it helps us to organize the chaos as well. So it just makes those things a little less frightening. And of course, as well, if that truly does happen, it might spur us into action and less into paralysis.
Yeah, I think it's a really nice idea to think of the Anthropocene and the concepts around it as well as some sort of like catalyst for you to do something before it's too late, or something like that. So yeah, I think it's really interesting to think about it that way. And so yeah, I think that leads me to the last question of the interview. And I hope I want to end it on an optimistic note as well. And so I'm going to ask you to share your opinions on the future of the Eco-Gothic in terms of its kind of popularity and impact upon academia and the wider society. So the idea kind of what direction do you think that the Eco-Gothic would take in the future, kind of given the political and socio-political issues that we've been through for the past years, and also with COVID-19 as well.
Yeah. So when I was reading this question, it made me think of an essay in the first issue of the journal by Tom Hillard, which is basically an essay where he compares kind of our reactions to what's going on with climate crisis and the developments of eco-criticism to an eco-horror film. And he basically says, what if we're in a film right now? What if our reactions are different points of the film? Which point of the film are we up to? And his essay is called The Body in the Basement, because what he basically argues is that we're at the point where we've been slowly feeling like something's a bit creepy about the cabin, something's a bit wrong, maybe we need to find out what's going on. And someone said, oh, there's a weird sound in the basement. We've gone downstairs and, oh my God, our worst fears have come true. There is a corpse. And we don't know how it's died, but we know it has died, and we know that we're probably next. And he says we're at the point now where we're all looking at it a bit dumbstruck and maybe looking at each other. And we're kind of going back to what Michelle was saying about paralysis. This is where we are right now. And for me, that rings quite true. And I think in terms of the future of the Eco-Gothic, I think part of what we're going to see is more and more text and more discussions as this kind of becomes more and more mainstream and interesting to everyone. But I do think it's going to get bigger. I don't think it's going away. And he says, He says at one point, like, eco-criticism and all of these fears are having a moment, and then he says it's a moment to stay, and I would absolutely agree with that. In terms of kind of key themes moving forward, there were just two that I wanted to mention. You mentioned COVID there. That's something that we actually talk about quite a lot in the introduction to the latest issue of the journal, because there's obviously huge environmental factors when you're talking about COVID-19. And I think with the pandemic, it's a really interesting one, because in some ways it's really specific, in some ways it's terrifyingly vague. So it's both immediate and kind of frozen all at once. And there's more we can unpack in the discussion afterwards if we want to, but there's also very Gothic origins of that. You know, all the kind of rumours of where COVID came from. It came from a bat, allegedly from eating bat soup. That's kind of an icon of the Gothic in itself. And then the other thing I'll just say really quickly, because I know Michelle's talked about it very eloquently already, is that we really do need to decolonise the Eco-Gothic. And for me, that's something I really want to see happening, and it's something that I'm kind of throwing out into the universe, is that we're very, very interested in having some guest editors come in and do a special issue on decolonising the Eco-Gothic for us. And I think that's important to diversify both in terms of content and contributors, and that's something we really, really are keen to support.
Wholeheartedly seconded. I think would bite your arm off if anyone does want to maybe do a special issue on decolonising the Eco-Gothic. Yeah, there's quite a lot to say about Eco-Gothic and COVID-19, but potentially you could pick that up in the questions again. But the couple of things I wanted to add about the future direction of Eco-Gothic. Firstly, I think the direction of travel is that it's going to be increasingly interdisciplinary. Eco-criticism, the new wave of eco-criticism, is inherently interdisciplinary. It's sparking and engaging with concepts, theories, and other critical discussions across the environmental humanities and sciences. And I think Eco-Gothic will do the same as it evolves. And I also think that it has to evolve in this way. Kind of going back to what Clark says, it's not enough that we kind of continue to simply identify well-known assertions that Gothic literature challenges romantic ideals of nature. And I think the articles that we're publishing in issue 2 is testament to this kind of new direction of travel as well. We've got subjects that are published in issue 2 ranging from environmental philosophy to ecological science, cultural historiography to food politics. And these articles have not only added like original contributions to literary scholarship, but they demonstrate in particular the value that Gothic has to wider discussions of eco-social crisis. So, it's a two-way street. I think it's really important to have that. The latest Gothic Nature Conference, which happened online in October last year, I think it's testament to this increasing interdisciplinarity as well. So, for example, Catherine Price, her paper discussed the central role that Frankenstein has played in framing the genetically modified food debate, for example, particularly in popular media. And Lauren McKee did a paper which sparked discussion about the potential for Eco-Gothic activism, which was really interesting. So Lorraine's an ecologist advocating the protection of understudied UK species, so bats, insects, toads, rats, for example. And her paper looked at how the Eco-Gothic provides a useful lens to deconstruct and better understand the public's fear about these kind of unloved animals. And the discussion afterwards was really great because we were talking about the possibility of Gothic animal conservation. So yeah, in a nutshell, I guess interdisciplinarity and potential activism could be two new ways, could be the future of Eco-Gothic.
Yeah, I think that's the important role of Eco-Gothic in literature, contemporary literature now. It's quite hopeful to see that there's a rise in Eco-Gothic literature, and especially kind of the directions that you mentioned as well, how decolonising the Eco-Gothic, I think is definitely one of the most important kind of thing to do at the moment, to kind of involve more voices and diversities of cultures. So yeah, so that is the end of the interview, and so now I'll give the space for the audience. If any of you have any questions, please turn on the camera and unmute yourself to speak.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
Well, hello there.
Hi.
Hi.
Good afternoon. I wanted to, well, I had a lot of questions, but you've been answering them as you kept talking. So, and Trang also asked some of them after I thought of the questions. But mm Michelle mentioned something about COVID, and I think that matter is quite interesting, considering the deathly potential that it has. Could we consider like COVID and this pandemic disease as a type of eco-gothic if we transpose that to a narrative level?
Would you like to go first with this, Elizabeth, or?
I'm happy to. I'm trying to think now, because I know we spent a lot of time talking about this, Michelle, but thinking off the top of my head, I know there's lots of ways that I think the pandemic is Gothic. Like, it's, that there's people talking about viral eco-Gothic now. And I'm thinking, even before the pandemic, an image that kept coming up in conferences was tentacular Gothic, and things just spreading out and being uncontrollable and growing and growing and growing. And that's obviously something we see with coronavirus. I think you've also got kind of Gothic elements there with the kind of spectral nature of it, like it's everywhere, but you can't see it. And that's really quite frightening as well. And then, like I mentioned very briefly, the bat origin, and there's something in that as well, as the sense that we've eaten it, we've imbibed the Gothic in some way. But Michelle, I don't know if you want to build on that.
Yeah, sure. I think that the creepiest thing with, I've talked about obviously Gothic environments kind of becoming a reality. I think COVID-19 emerged out of a kind of Gothic environment of our own making, for sure. And it is quite creepy. It's just this idea that the intensity of anthropogenic land use has created these kind of really damaging, hazardous interfaces between like people, livestock, wildlife, and ultimately diseases that can make the jump from animals to humans. So, I mean, if the Gothic's obsessed with these kind of, breaking boundaries and intermeshing and stuff, and we've literally created these spaces where animals, disease, humans all kind of blend into one. And also these spaces sit on the kind of periphery of civilization, the kind of weird shadowy borders of civilization that we don't like to talk about, that kind of repressed side of society. So COVID's kind of emerged out of this Gothic environment, and it's brought to light these uncomfortable truths about our relationship with nature that we can't ignore anymore. And like that in itself is just a Gothic tale 101, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. And I wanted to ask again about that, because going back to what Elizabeth talked about, the ways in which we experience fear linked to nature and so on. I think that it's also interesting that COVID is also a part of nature, a part we can't control, but people don't seem to be that afraid of this natural frightening aspect, and why do you think this is?
Interesting. It's probably going to be a very depressing answer, but I think part of it is human arrogance and the kind of the ease with which, if something's not immediately affecting you, a lot of humans can push it down. And we see it in the behavior of a lot of people who aren't kind of taking the pandemic seriously, I think. And I think there's that element as well of, like I said earlier, it's invisible, it's spectral. And then add to that this big theme of how we're reacting to climate crisis generally, of paralysis. And I think that plays a huge part as well, is that you keep hearing people saying, oh, let's wait for the science to come in. The science has been in for a very, very long time. And yet people seem frozen in these discussions of, well, we're not really sure if it's a problem, especially when you get to the kind of the extreme end of the spectrum with people denying that there even is a problem. So I think that's kind of what I'd say there.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to that thing about like fear underpins so much that we're not aware of. So apathy and that feeling of overwhelmingness is underpinned by fear, it's centered in fear, but it just comes out in these ways of just inaction, paralysis, denial. And I think maybe something similar is going on there, because again, the climate crisis is terrifying, but in our everyday lives, I don't live my life I mean, hand on heart, I don't live my life in fear of climate crisis every day, because that's just impossible. So it could be the same kind of thing going on with, our reactions to COVID-19.
Okay.
I really like the point you made there about it being something natural in itself as well. I think that's quite a sort of challenging and interesting idea there as well.
Yeah, agreed.
Okay, thank you for your insightful panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Elizabeth Bell, do you have a question? Do you want to turn on your camera? And
yes. Thank you very much for your very clear presentation of both the Eco-Gothic and the Ecophoro. And I was thinking about the intersection between the Eco-Gothic and history. And I was seeing this both thinking about Nathaniel Hawthorne and also Washington Irving. And then I was also thinking of Quentin Tarantino's film, The Hateful Eight, where basically these men are trapped in the wilderness by snow and are in some ways forced to sort of engage with, again, the history of violence that has basically brought them there. So those are the examples that I thought of, but I was wondering if you had looked at more broadly this question of that intersection.
Do you want to go, Shell, or shall I?
You go for it.
Yeah. So the first thing that I thought of, well, first of all, a really interesting question. Thank you. The first thing that I thought of was a term that I came across. I'm forgetting the critic's name now. It might come to me in a minute, but she talks about something called heritage noir, so kind of dark heritage, and how horror in the Gothic is often about us being haunted by ill actions of the past, right? And you see that in kind of, Indian burial grounds and things being the reason why the Massive House is haunted. It goes back to history and to terrible, terrible things that we have done. And I think you do see that in a lot of eco-Gothic texts, because, we've been talking a lot in this interview about kind of really quite recent and present destruction of nature and mistreatment of nature. But a lot of that goes back a very long way. So I think, that was the first thing that came to my mind, was thinking of this kind of heritage noir and that kind of darkness in our history of the treatment of nature. But that's all I can think of off the top of my head. But I know, Michelle, this is more your kind of area with Hawthorne and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, Hawthorne, I think just going back to, I think I briefly touched on this. I think if you think of the Gothic, even European Gothic kind of emerged out of a reaction to industrialization. And Nathaniel Hawthorne is just a really interesting case, because I think he was writing in reaction to a time when New England was being heavily deforested. And he was very, very aware of this as well, and being surrounded by conversations to do with transcendentalist philosophy as well, which he was actually not an advocate of that movement either. He liked to deal in realities, not this kind of weird metaphysical portrayal of nature that they had. So I think I did a bit of a case study on Nathaniel Hawthorne, so I can only really speak for him, but I imagine he's not the only case where actually a lot of his Gothic environments are a reaction to the genuine realities of environmental destruction that were happening at that time. I hope that is your question.
I might be completely wrong. It was Hawthorne the one who also had a load of guilt about the history of his own family members?
Yes, he was.
Yeah, I'm thinking that's kind of interesting as well, in that conversation of Eco-Gothic and history too, of kind of a very sort of close connection on the bloodline. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Question from Laura.
Hi. Well, thank you for your interesting answers. I was wondering, so I'm handling the other thematic session on cyber terror, and something that has come up in both the interviews that I've done for that panel is this contrast with nature, right? And how many, say, narratives and critiques and transhumanism and this kind of things oppose the cyber and the nature, but I was wondering if they kind of work in the same way, because you were talking a lot about this idea of the human and non-human and this kind of connection with the other in animals, but also this is how we've been discussing that it works when it's the uncanny in the cyber or in the robot. And somehow to escape the cyber terror, we could tend to go to nature. But if there's also this Gothic and this other in nature, how we position ourselves. So how do you see this relation between these two things that could also work to, I don't know, to further human in this transhumanist, posthumanism sense, and in opposition maybe to the Anthropocene and all these type of narratives?
Interesting question. Michelle, I feel like I keep jumping in, but do you want to go first or do you want me to?
No, you go for it. I'm just making notes. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to unpack there. So you said the panel was on cyber terror, and did you say it was cyber terror and one other word that I think I missed?
It's cyber terror, automata, and technocratic realities.
Oh gosh, that's
the title.
Yeah, well, the first thing that came to mind is I think you're absolutely right that there is that kind of tension there. And I can't, you know, there's when you think talking about cliches, when you have these horror films where people are going into the wilderness, how often do you get that like slow explanation of how they're quote unquote off the grid? Like you hear really quickly, like, oh, the cell phones don't work. We've got no Wi-Fi. We're completely disconnected. So I think you're absolutely right to pick up on that it's kind of almost like an opposite. But it also got me thinking, as you were saying your question, I was thinking, oh, are there texts that kind of merge the two together? And then I was thinking about Cabin in the Woods, and how I think that's a really fascinating example of how kind of technology and wilderness come together, because that's a completely manipulated environment. And for anyone who hasn't seen it, it's a very, very meta film where you start off thinking, oh, okay, it's one thing, and then it quickly turns into something else. But it's kind of a forest where it's enclosed, everything is computerized underneath the ground. There's this whole like sense of what lies beneath. And I don't really know what I want to unpack there, except for I know my brain is thinking that, oh, there's something there, and you got me excited when you're talking about cyber terror and this. I was like, oh, I wonder about cyber terror and Cabin in the Woods. But yeah, I'll think about that more, and I'll probably come up with an answer at 10 o'clock tonight, which won't be useful. But thank you for the question anyway. It's really interesting.
Yeah, it was a really thought-provoking question, actually. I have thoughts which might end up being word salad, but we will go with the thoughts and see where we get to. But I think with Eco-Gothic, there's this oscillation between fear of nature, but also anxieties about what we're doing with nature. So if we're thinking about like technocracy, and I guess that really Gothic tradition of has technology gone too far, I think there could be something to be said for the idea that actually if we invest so much in technology, which in part is used to shield us from nature and from the hostilities, so-called hostilities of nature, maybe it could also be a question of, have we shielded ourselves? Has technology gone too far? And in doing so, is there even a nature to go back to, so to speak? I think Margaret Atwood deals with that. I haven't read the text in a few years, so someone might be able to help me, but they create these like blue monsters. I can't remember what they're called, if anyone has read the text, but they're these kind of
I was thinking also about Margaret Atwood when you mentioned the Man-Adam trilogy, because there's also this idea of the improved human, or some changes to the human that has a lot to do with the cyborg, but also in terms of if nature improves, there's some connection there too.
Yeah, because they're kind of at one with their nature, but they lose their humanness in order to become one with nature, or at least in harmony with nature, which is something really interesting there. And the true kind of monster of, especially with Orcs and Crake, is obviously is Jimmy, who kind of this very human character that kind of haunts the woods. He's quite a manic, strange, kind of a very dirty figure in the end that haunts the woods. That I think I wish I could remember what they were called, but these kind of post-human monsters that Crake designs is, you know, he's almost like the id to their ego in a weird way. But yeah, a bit word salad, but there's definitely really there's lots of stuff there to think about. So thank you.
Lara, did you have kind of an answer to that as you were asking the question? Because I'd be really interested.
I was thinking more in terms of, so one of the keynotes that we had was Anja Heise van der Lippe, and she mentioned this idea of transhumanism and kind of how we tend to escape to nature as an opposition to the cyber terror, but also something that comes from the very Gothic tradition of Frankenstein, and this kind of, what I was saying, this modification of the human, and that turns into the cyber. And more recent texts is Frankenstein by Janet Winterson, if you're familiar with that, deals a lot with the idea of the horror of being human and the automatas gaining conscience. But it's also this idea, if the cyber and the robots become human, at what point they become so conscious and human they are also nature, right? So this idea that you were also mentioning of connecting the human and then non-human, and then where that division is, like if we want to go over that division when we relate to animals, for example, which is what some eco-criticisms try to do, right? To connect to nature in that sense that we empathize with everything besides the human. But also, if you go to the other side where we situate the cyber, this could also be expanded in that direction as well.
Really interesting, thank you.
Just quickly to add, I've seen quite a few kind of popular scientific articles. I'm trying to think off the top of my head, but I've seen quite a few times that the Anthropocene being described or framed in terms of Frankenstein, and the Earth, this kind of monster or kind of our own creation that's coming back to haunt us, something that we've crafted.
That's exactly, that's because the technology that we created, it's something that there's something that's horror there as well now.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Do we have any more questions? Yeah. Yeah, we have a question from Carolina. Is that how do you pronounce your name? Sorry, but yeah, unmute yourself and speak, please.
Okay, thank you very much to both of you and then the whole panel, okay, for keeping us together in this very interesting project. My question has to do with something that both of you, Elizabeth and Michelle, have mentioned, this idea of decolonizing the eco-Gothic as a sort of a pending business, something that has not been really addressed or resolved, okay? Especially considering the very Eurocentric component of the eco-Gothic, especially, I mean, considering the examples, okay, that you have given, okay, taken from very canonical American or European writers. And I also say Eurocentric because of its binary understanding of nature and culture. I mean, if we think that indigenous cultures or non-European cultures have developed a completely different relationship with nature, like more eco-friendly or more harmonious or more respectful and sustainable, I wonder how this element of ecophobia or of considering nature as the threatening other that presides eco-Gothic might be formulated by these other writers or this other context, okay? I don't know whether you have come out with some authors or examples that somehow conceive the eco-Gothic in non-Eurocentric or in non-binary, okay, sort of ways or rhetorics. I don't know. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really important question. I'm going to be very, very tentative because this is the I feel, and I'm unfortunately, my work has been very Eurocentric itself, and it's just, I think in the past year, this is when we've been really recognizing and plugging for like decolonizing the eco-Gothic. But I think we're actually really missing out on really important scholarship. Like you said, I think Indigenous views of nature are going to be different. We're going to have biases towards what we think they are, but actually we need to hear from these people, from these scholars. Equally, I think Gothic's going to mean something completely different, because Gothic in traditional sense is Eurocentric, it is Euro-American centric. So it's going to change completely our definitions and understandings of Eco-Gothic, but in really important ways. And it's going to open up so much discussion that we've probably not even thought about yet. And equally, I think it will change definitions of ecophobia, because that seems to be very Euro-American centric as well. I think just going back to Katarina Barnes's essay, when there's been this tradition with Canadian eco-horror that sees a central premise to it, and not just Canadian eco-horror, but Canadian literature, is this hostility against nature. And Katarina Barnes actually says, well, no, it's, yes, perhaps for white settler traditions, horror is inherent within nature, but for Inuit cultures, for Indigenous peoples, actually the horror comes from the treatment of Indigenous peoples and land as well. So it completely challenges this kind of inherent understanding of what Canadian literature is, but obviously Canadian eco-horror specifically. Elizabeth, I don't know if you want to add kind of to that.
Yeah. I feel like we need to drink every time we mention Katarina Barnes, because we're mentioning her a lot, but I was going to do the same again, because her essay really challenged the way that I think, because she talked a lot about Inuit folktales, and she kind of reproduced some of them in some ways, and it made me go and look at them again. And she just basically talked about how different those are from Eurocentric fairy tales and folk tales, particularly in the construction of nature. So she talks about, like you were saying, that kind of nature versus culture, that binary, that's really much more blurred in these stories that she was talking about, where it's not nature that's brutal, it's humans that are brutal. That brutality of nature is a brutality that we belong to, that we're part of, we're not separate to. And then the only other thing I was going to say was, I have personally seen more coming in about Asian eco-Gothic and Asian eco-horror. There still needs to be a hell of a lot more work done, but I'm seeing quite sort of interesting conversations, particularly around Japanese, Korean texts. And when you said, will these different voices formulate differently how we think of eco-Gothic, eco-horror? I really hope so. I think it has to. I think that's a very, very important development. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I was very curious, about this different formulation, of the genres, because the relationship with nature is completely different. So let's stay tuned, about these voices, and let's hear, what they have to say. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, just to reiterate, I don't think Elizabeth will argue with this, so sorry for speaking on your behalf, but I feel like our answers and knowledge of this is woeful, and hence why we want to invite special, I think it was also not our place. I think a guest editor doing a special issue on this would be amazing, and would do wonders in terms of our own knowledge, but obviously also for the Eco-Gothic community.
Thank you.
Any more questions from the audience? Okay, it seems like, there's no other questions. And so I actually want to say a final thank you for coming, and it's been wonderful to talk about the Eco-Gothic, and I've literally been enlightened by what you've been saying about the Eco-Gothic as well, and definitely lots of ideas and knowledge there to take home and to think about as well. So thank you very much for coming. So
thank you so much for organising, and thank you everyone for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yes, thank you so much, and thank you for the thought-provoking questions as well.
Thank you. If we can just turn our cameras on to kind of say thank you to Elizabeth and Michelle, that would be great.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the very interesting talk, and I think thank you very much to our public as well that actually participated in the Q&A session.